All right, so we are talking about the Sabbath today, and I think we all kind of intuitively know that the Sabbath is about rest, that you work 6 days, you rest on the seventh day, and that's a very important discipline. It's very healthy to do. It's also something that we in our culture, especially here in Orange County, are really, really dangerously bad at. And to be honest, having lived both here and up in Silicon Valley, it sometimes seems like we're a little worse than up there. I can't stress enough how important it is that we rest our bodies and rest our minds. Now, Sabbath was not just about resting our bodies. Sabbath comes from all the way back to like Genesis 1, when in the first story of creation, where God is described as creating the world in 6 days, and then on the seventh he rests. And that seventh day of resting isn't like just, God gets tired, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but it becomes this pattern that we are then expected to follow. The ultimate kind of ancient meaning behind this Sabbath rest requires the recognition that you can take your hand off the plow, if you were an ancient agrarian society, or more likely, you can take your hand off your hammer, off your phones, take your brain out of your emails, your fingers off the computers, and guess what? The world will continue on without you. That is very hard for us to come to terms with, even though we may cognitive or sort of know, like, yeah, of course, the world's not going to end if I don't answer my email, but just, hold on a second. I just want to read up on it or something like that. It's hard for us to let go, but the reality is that God resting is God saying that he has created this world that is good. It functions as he intended it. And when he commands us to rest, he is saying, trust that the world will continue on without you working for a day. Now, that's all set up. We're going to go walking through the passage that you just heard read, but we're going to do it out of order. That first bit, that come to me, all you who are weary, and I'll give you rest and all that good stuff, that actually sets up what's about to happen. But I think for dramatic effect, I want to do the story first, and you'll see then in retrospect how it plays out. So Jesus, he went through the grain fields with his disciples on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." So ancient Jewish culture, and modern Jewish culture, but this is the ancient one we're talking about, there were 39 different kinds of work that you could not do. And part of that, or a lot of that, just grew out of the fact that people were just trying to follow God's commandments. Among the big 10 of the 10 commandments, it said, keep the Sabbath holy, don't work. So the question arose as time went on, well, what does it mean to not work? Can I pick something heavy up and carry it? Well, yeah, I guess so. But there comes a point when you carry it too far and that's starting to sound like work. You couldn't, for example, mix two substances to create a third, which sounds ridiculous to me, but if my job were to, say, make concrete, well, the fact that I can't mix two substances and make a third means that I really can't work. I'm forced to rest. So these rules, these 39 types of work, were not bad. But as you will see, they took them a little too far. In this case, this is Matthew we're reading out of. Luke actually includes the detail that they were plucking them. Plucking is an action that is not forbidden. But then they were rubbing them in their hands And so then that becomes reaping, which you're not allowed to do. And then the Pharisees see this and they're saying, Jesus, they're breaking the rules. Now, we think of Pharisees as this monolithic group of religious leaders who just did not like fun and sought to ruin everything for everybody. But the Pharisees, as I like to point out, were very diverse. And in fact, they were split in particular, in a very similar way to, say, like modern American politics. Things are basically split. Democrat, Republican, they do not get along. They have very different ideas of how the country should be run. And if we want to put the best construction on things, we have to at least agree that each side, to some extent, wants the same thing, the prosperity of our country. Well, in the same way, the Pharisees were very split. They were divided into two, essentially, something called Beth Hillel and Beth Shammai. They both wanted to follow God and his commandments, but they disagreed on how to do that. The party in control at the time of Jesus were very conservative. And so it would make sense that this particular half of the Pharisees would be pointing out, hey, Jesus, your disciples are reaping. That is breaking the Sabbath. Now, why were they following Jesus? I don't really know. But by this point in time, Jesus had become very popular. He had already run into conflict with certain religious leaders, so he's like kind of that media darling bad boy or something like that. They're just trying to catch him. So this is all setting up the conflict here. Now, Jesus answered, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. So this is the great King David, the warrior poet, the one who followed after God's own heart, who was the first real king of Israel. His predecessor kind of failed. He was like to the ancient Israelites as King Arthur was to the Britons. All right, so there's a long story. I'll let you read it yourself, but he is on official business. He and his guys are starving, and they come across the tabernacle, the house of God, where God dwells. And there's this special sacred bread, which you're not allowed to eat, at least David would not be, but they're starving. And so he gives it to them. Because the sacred bread is good. It's good that it is where it is in God's house, but when you're looking at somebody who's really hungry, especially somebody like David, well, of course you can have it. So God is using a precedent in the Bible to explain why it's okay for he and his disciples to break the Sabbath. And then he goes, or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? So if you're a priest in the temple, you have to do all of these sacrifices. You have to carry things and set things up. If there's a boy that needs to be circumcised because he's 8 days old, of course you're going to do it. In other words, they technically break the Sabbath. But they're serving a much higher cause. He's saying this is okay in certain circumstances. And then Jesus, he's not really doubling down, he's tripling down, if that's even a thing. He says, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. Now, both of these stories or these examples involve the temple. But then Jesus saying something greater than the temple is here would have evoked a response in these Pharisees, something like oh, really? Here's the analogy. Imagine I'm preaching. Well, I am actually preaching. Hold on. That was not intended. And I were to say, so you've got the sacrament here, which in a little bit, when we say the blessing, we do the consecration, Jesus is present. That is his promise. He is present, as we would say, in, with, and under this bread and this wine. It is a sacred, holy meal because of Jesus' promised presence. It would be like me saying, Jesus is present in these sacraments, but something greater than the sacraments is right here. I would have a career for about 2 more days. That's what I calculated out. Because first, Pastor Christensen would have to, contact the district office, and then the district president would come down and beat me with my own stole or something like that. No, you don't say that. The temple is the very presence of God, not the metaphorical, but that is where God is present. And yet Jesus is saying that, that's good, but something better is here. Now, sometimes you might hear critics of Jesus or the Bible saying well, Jesus never claimed to be God. Yeah, he did. Among many other times, he did it right there. So then, Jesus twists the knife. He says, if you had known that what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. So he quotes a prophet saying, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, which in that context was a way of God saying, I don't want you to go through the motions and forget the meaning. It is very easy, even as a pastor, to come to church because that's what you do. All right, I'm just going to go through the motions. I come to church, I sing the songs, I say the prayers, I pay very careful attention to the preaching, right? Please? And you say hi to the people, whatever, and then you go home. It's very easy to do that and not realize that you enter into this space because the all-creator of the universe sent his son to take on mortality for you, to take on your death, to be raised from the dead and create a new reality within your heart. That you join your brothers and sisters in this Jesus, as we have done for 2,000 years. That when Jesus himself walked out of his tomb, the world, and I mean literally, was never the same. Or you can just go, okay, I'm supposed to stand up, sit down, walk forward, get my bread and my little wine, and then walk. In other words, Jesus is saying, don't forget that the Sabbath is a gift. It is a day of rest, a day of worship, a day of acknowledging that God created this world for us. We are caught up in this pattern, this rhythm of creation that has gone on before me and will continue to go on after I die. That it is a gift. And then Jesus says, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now at that point, you would hear like that, the record scratch and the freeze frame. Because Jesus just said he's Lord of the Sabbath. His Pharisee enemies would be going, are you really going to make that claim? Now, by the way, when this section ends, there's a little more after this. These same guys start to plot and figure out how to kill Jesus. And the reason for it is actually very simple. See, as we went back way to the beginning, this moment of creation, and God establishes like this rest. God rests. It's not because he got tired. And it's not even the kind of rest that we think. Like when we think of rest, we think of like carrying maybe a bunch of stuff, walking to that right spot, digging your feet into the hot sand, collapsing into a beach chair, and just watching the waves, and trying to do as little as possible. And we tend to think of God resting on that seventh day as though God has all of this creation and he reaches down into his creation and selects like a lime and takes a wedge and then pops it into a Corona and sits by a pool. In other words, we think of rest as disengagement. Now, there is a sense in which rest requires disengagement. You cannot be engaged and on all the time. It will kill you. Your body can't handle that stress. Your mental health can't handle that kind of stress. Your spirit will die. But when God rests, divine rest for a Hebrew is not about that disengagement. It is about engagement. God creates this world, and it is humming. It has this rhythm to it. And when God takes his rest, it means to an ancient Hebrew that his presence now comes and imbues this creation. And now it's time to get to work. But real, lasting work. It's like you've constructed the machine and now it is humming. You've laid out all of your tools and everything you need to build that thing, and it is set, it is perfect, and now it's time to get started. It is a kind of engagement that doesn't have that frustrating, irritating thing where every little thing goes wrong, because our experience of creation is after the fall, after things went terribly wrong. So when I think about the things that I do just to sort of keep life together, like I'll work really, really hard during the day, most days, right, Pastor Scott? But then I go home, and there are some stuff I've got to do at home. You just have to do it, otherwise the whole household will be a mess. And I'm thinking, you go, and I'll do it, and I'll make sure I do the best job I can, and make sure everything is set as it's supposed to be. And then I wake up the next morning, and of course there's still more to do. And I'm talking about dishes. There's always more dishes. But that is after the fall, when that Sabbath rest that God rested in had been disrupted. There's this frustrating reality to our lives that is not rest. It is not Sabbath. And as the rabbis began to think, like after the Old Testament was written, about what it was going to be like when God sends his hero, the Messiah. And God finally does what he promised he'd do. The Messiah comes and does his thing, and he brings justice to the world. And God's presence now more fully just erupts from the temple on Mount Zion. And everything is now back as it should be. The kingdom of God has come. What would it look like? And the rabbis started to say, it will be like a Sabbath. When that frustration that we have with creation, that constant fighting within ourselves, that fighting within our relationships is finally done, and all of creation and all of God's people breathe a sigh of relief. Everything is as it should be. That is what it will be like when the Messiah comes. And there Jesus says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He's saying on the one hand, he gets to decide what is considered work and what isn't. And he's also saying, I'm the Messiah. I am the one you've been waiting for. Now we go back to the first part that we heard read. He says, come to me all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Sabbath rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. And that doesn't mean like disembodied soul. That's like you. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The yoke is like, the big thing that goes around beasts of burden that they'll pull the plow and that sort of thing. I don't know. I was born in Southern California. I've been on a farm like 4 times. So I just vaguely know that that's how it works. But people were talking actually around the time of Jesus that for following God, it means one, taking on the yoke of heaven, which means trusting in God, And 2, taking on the yoke of his teaching or his commandments. Not in like this brutal way where you've got to follow all of these rules or he's going to be very upset. But rather that these are the rules that will free you if you follow his commandments. But what is Jesus saying? Saying, I have a different yoke. One that brings Sabbath rest. Now, there will come a day, this is the promise of Easter, when all of creation lets out its sigh of relief, when everything is back as it should be, when God finishes what he started when he raised Jesus from the dead. But it's not yet. But in the meantime, as God continues to grow us, as you have received the very Spirit of God, that Sabbath rest is already becoming a reality within you that will one day be completed. That being a disciple, a follower of Jesus, means that slowly but surely, and sometimes nothing will happen, and all of a sudden you realize that I can handle this. But over time, God is removing that enmity, that frustration, that anxiety that we bear, showing that as you take your hands off and stop trying to control everything around you, that God, by his Spirit, is working very powerfully in you and through you. That Sabbath rest is just as much something that he creates within you as it is something that you do. So my prayer for us is that, one, we rest, because we, as Southern Californians, we are really bad at it, and myself included. It is a deep concern that I have just as a pastor. And that, 2, that we realize that engaged presence of God, that real Sabbath rest, is a reality that is already growing within your hearts. That as God continues to raise the death within you to new life, he is also growing that Sabbath rest in your heart. Let's pray.